It's Halloween and I want to tell you the best spooky stories from each Doctor's era. First, I'm going to set some ground rules. 1. There can only be TV stories in this list, except for the 8th Doctor Paul McGann, who, because of his very few live action stories, I'm going to allow a big finish, because that's what his Doctor was most known for. Also, I'm not going to be discussing the War Doctor John Hurt, because I know his Doctor the least, and the stories I have seen of his Doctor, it's mostly a big war thing. So I'm not going to be discussing the stories from his era because I feel like they're least fitting in with this list. So, with all that said, on with the video. The William Hartnell era, despite being made by the BBC in the early 1960s, actually has some unsettling stories, despite the limitations of what you could and couldn't show at the time. Now, I could have said the 10th Planet, creepy Cybermen were a close call for this spot, but I decided to go with the Dalek invasion of Earth. The story has a creepy vibe. The shots of the Daleks patrolling empty London gives a very apocalyptic vibe. The signs saying don't dump bodies in the river, the mindless rovermen all add up to give this story a really depressing and eerie atmosphere. I also feel like the Peter Cushing movie of this story manages to retain a lot of its atmosphere and adds and builds on, in some ways, on the Orwellian feel of the original. I would recommend this story, but if you find the classic series a bit slow, I also think the Peter Cushing movie is a good option. Now, on to the Patrick Troughton era, and for this spot on the list, I was torn between two stories. The first I was considering, Tomb of the Cybermen. The creepy Cybermen almost took the spot for this story, but I decided to go with the Web of Fear. This story has a very creepy vibe. The shots of the Yeti walking through the London Underground, in my opinion, have always been a gold standard for the show's spooky history. This story is actually very important for the show's history. It's the first story we ever see of Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, and in some way is the groundwork for a lot of the Jon Pertwee era. It's the 1970s and Jon Pertwee is the 3rd Doctor, and there is only one obvious choice for this list. In my opinion, the best 3rd Doctor story for Halloween is obviously the Damons, Doctor Who's attempt at a Wicker Man-like horror film. This story is perfect for Halloween. It's literally about the Master summoning the devil. Perfect. If Hammer were ever going to make a Doctor Who film, it would be this. I think this story is perfect for Halloween, and in fact, if you can only watch one story from this list, I'd highly recommend you watch the Damons. It is top tier Doctor Who content. Tom Baker, arguably the most popular classic series Doctor. Choosing the Halloween story for this Doctor was more difficult than most people expect. There are a lot of great 4th Doctor horror stories, and this spot almost went to the brain of Morbius. No, not that Morbius, the other one. Yeah, that one. But due to recent revelations in the canon, this story has left a bitter taste in my mouth, so I decided to give this spot to the horror of Fang Rock. I have reviewed this story, so if you want an in-depth look, just click at the top of the screen. All I can say for this story is it is brilliant 70s Doctor Who horror, and in some ways is one of the best Doctor Who stories, especially for the Tom Baker era. It's the 80s and we now have Peter Davidson as the Doctor, and it was surprisingly difficult to pick a story out for this, so I thought to go with The Awakening. This story is never really mentioned, but I think it's actually pretty good. Okay, look, let's be honest, I couldn't actually find a properly scary Peter Davison TV story. I know there are some big finishers that are a bit creepy in places, but his Doctor has a lot of just 80s sci-fi and not a lot of gothic horror like the others do. And there isn't much playing with political metaphors. I could have put his Dalek story here, but chose not to because it was an obvious choice. And also, I don't think it's very good. So, it's the 6th Doctor, and the scariest story is... No, please, no!
It was a cold, wet night in November, 22 years ago.
There was a police box in a junkyard. We didn't know where it would go.
So after that, in my opinion, the best Sixth Doctor story for Halloween is Vengeance on Varos. I have reviewed this story, so if you want a more in-depth look at it, just click the top of the screen like before. This is arguably the best Sixth Doctor TV story and deals with the violence and problems you have with reality television, and is actually more fitting to the modern social media age than it was back in the 80s, and the story itself is still very relevant. Sylvester McCoy, the last Doctor of the classic series, and arguably one of the best Doctors. The choice was actually very easy, as were all the choices from this point on in the video. The choice for this Doctor is The Curse of Fenrick. If you're a fan of the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, then I think you'll be a fan of this story. The story deals with the Doctor fighting the eldritch god Fenrick, which their battle has been raging for centuries, and it's the first ever Doctor Who story to be set in World War II. I really think this is a great classic Doctor Who story for Halloween, and I would have loved to have seen this tone be continued on if the classic series had got another couple of series. For Paul McGann, this choice was easy. Chimes of Midnight. This story isn't going to be for everyone, due to it being a Big Finish audio drama. This story is perfect for people who don't like the new series Christmas specials for their overly positive vibe, which doesn't fit in with the rest of the show. This story is very dark. In fact, some might say it's too dark. The story has frequent talks of suicide. It might be a bit too much for some people. Personally, I think it's one of the best Big Finish 8th Doctor stories, but this won't be for everyone's taste. Christopher Eccleston's 9th Doctor had probably one of the best series of the new show. His Halloween story is of course the two-parter, The Empty Child and The Doctor Dances. This two-part story might be the best horror story of the new series. The creepy empty child with its gas mask and its repetition of "Are you my mummy?" has always given me the chills. Also, the horrific sequence of Dr. Constantine turning into a gas mask zombie has always stuck in my mind as one of the creepiest moments in the show's history. David Tennant is arguably the most popular incarnation of the Doctor, and for me this choice was pretty easy, Midnight. This story has such a creepy atmosphere and, in some ways, is heavily similar to the John Carpenter film The Thing. The underlying sense of you can't trust anyone is heavily in this story's atmosphere. This story actually features David Troughton, who is the son of Patrick Troughton. If you're wondering why I didn't go with Blink, it's because I think it's massively overrated and is nowhere near the best Weeping Angel story. Matt Smith is the 11th Doctor, and he actually has quite a lot of spooky stories, such as Night Terrors and the God Complex. However, I'm going with Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone. I have a few reasons for putting this story on the list. First off, the writing is great. In fact, stories from Series 5 are great. And the other reason is I want to keep a Weeping Angel story on the list, because they are easily the most terrifying new series villain. Also, this story is the best Weeping Angel story. I don't care, this is better than Blink. Peter Capaldi, the 12th Doctor. I was so close to picking out Listen. It's unbelievable, but I decided to go with one of my favourite Peter Capaldi stories, Under the Lake and Before the Flood. I didn't go with Listen, mostly because if you haven't seen everything from Series 8 before, then you won't understand parts of it, and there are some references to other parts of that series. Under the Lake and Before the Flood is, in my opinion, the closest the new series ever got to a classic series story. It feels like if it was in black and white and featured the second Doctor, it could easily fit into that late 60s era of classic Who. 13th Doctor time. This was easy. Arachnids in the UK, but it's got awful writing. The Witchfinders, but it's got awful writing. Orphan 55, but it's got awful writing. You can see there are something in common these stories have. I almost chose It Takes You Away, but I think there is a better story for this spot. The Haunting of Villa Diodati is actually my favourite Jodie Whittaker story. I love its gothic style, and it's actually probably the best example of Doctor Who doing a gothic horror. I know the story is based on a Big Finish story, The Silver Turk, and I do think that Big Finish story does it so much better. The Haunting Diodati is the best Jodie Whittaker story for Halloween. nothing else tops it. If you can only watch one story from this list, I'd watch The Damons. I think outside of Doctor Who, it's actually a very good little British horror story. Full of atmosphere, and it's actually very similar to the Hammer horror film The Devil Rides Out. Thank you so much for watching, have a very spooky Halloween.